Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Views on VUE, the podcast where we have a view on Vue.js. Good, I know. Thank you. I am Steve Edwards, the host with the face for radio and the voice for miming, but I'm still your host. And today with me back for yet another visit is Mr. Erik Hanchett. How you doing, Erik?
Hey, how's it going, Steve? It's good to be back. Good to talk about
Good.
Vue.
Yes, good to have you back. Good to have you back. Erik and I were just chatting beforehand and noticed that in his videos, he still has a reference to his Vue.js in Action book, which is a few years old and mostly on VUE. But if you still want to go buy it, you still can. The link in his YouTube videos.
Yeah, I have a list of links to just a bunch of different resources in my YouTube videos, and one of them happened to be my Vue.js in Action book, which is a few years old now, but I'm proud of it. It did really well. Helped a lot of people out. So
now you're independently wealthy because of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's I'm this actually. I'm not sure for the listeners out there, but I'm on my yacht right now. Okay, no, I was just lying. I don't have that. I'm
Yes.
in my office right now.
We all know that writing technical books is a very lucrative pastime. So
It is. It is. It's a labor of love. Yeah. I've been thinking about another version of it, like a revision 2 of the Vue.js in Action book, because of all the positivity of writing it the first time. But I just don't know if I don't know if I have the time. I'll put this out there. If anybody's listening right now and wants another Vue.js in Action version 2 with more Vue 3 stuff in, tweet me at ErikCH. And who knows? I'm actually might even be up for having someone be who's a really good writer that could co-author it. Who knows?
Yeah, I've worked on a couple books. I worked on a couple Drupal books with a buddy of mine who was writing books, and I was just the technical editor, just double checking stuff. And man, that took a lot of time.
Oh
Of
yeah,
time.
yeah,
So it's like,
yeah.
I don't think. And then when I made the videos for Vue Mastery, I worked with Adam Jar and that crew. Even just writing the scripts for the videos took forever, and I didn't even do the screencasting. They had somebody else do it for me. We talked about that in an episode with Adam Jar, and that took a lot of time. I'm like, okay, I'll do it once in a while, but not a regular thing for sure.
Yeah, I'm so impressed by the Vue Mastery, the Vue School people, like just the quality content they put out, and it's a lot of work putting in those videos out. My YouTube channel, I'm like literally an hour or two before, I'm like, that's an interesting topic. I'll put this together, and I'm like done in a few hours. But those guys, like, they got scripts, they got whole editing teams. Yeah, it's pretty impressive. Yeah.
In that episode with Adam, we went into all the details about who does what and all the people involved. I mean, like the guy that, and I'm already forgetting his name. I have to look it up. But the guy who did all of the scripting and the recording for me, and he was sort of like my director and video guy. He was awesome. It's definitely made the videos a lot better than they could have been. And the best thing about all the Vue Mastery videos was that they let me incorporate my dad jokes at the end of each one. So you don't get them on YouTube. You got to pay for them on Vue Mastery. But the best part is the dad jokes at the end.
Mm-hmm.
That's good or bad, depending on your point of view. Anyway, moving on to our topics for the day. For those of you who may not be familiar with Erik, he now works at AWS, Amazon Web Services, and is a developer relations guy, DevRel, I guess. Or I'm not sure what your developer advocate.
Yeah, developer advocate. Mm-hmm.
At AWS, having initially been hired to do some Vue development. Fortunately for Erik, he survived the layoffs at AWS. Been going around, so that's a relief. For sure, I've been the victim of third round of layoffs before in my own history, so I know how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we're going to talk about a new tool he's created for AWS using Vue.js. So why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I mentioned this in a previous podcast episode. So I've been doing, as part of my developer advocacy work, I'm new to developer advocacy. I've been doing front end development and back end development for my whole career. But part of being a DA, I've been submitting talks to a lot of different conferences, and a couple of the talks I've done. One is on creating open source libraries and tools. So for the last 2 years, I've been working on an open source team at AWS that works on the Amplify UI components library. And one of the first things we did when we started was we had a really old version of this library that was written in Stencil, Stencil.js, so it was using web components, which was fine, but we decided that we wanted to rewrite it in kind of like the native platforms, the native libraries out there, instead of using web components. And so we embarked on this journey for about 2 years to rewrite the VUE library for Amplify to use it in Vue 3. So instead of using an older Vue 2 version, we wanted this Amplify, and it was a UI library to be written in for Vue 3. And so that was my job for the first a good year and a half, probably closer to 2 years of maintaining and setting up that library. So I created a whole talk on this, on creating my first open source library, and I thought it'd be interesting. I could talk about some of the things that I learned in that process, and some of the things that worked well, and some things that didn't work well. So we can jump into that. How's that sound, Steve?
Sounds good to me. You're the expert on it, so I'll let you lead the way.
Yeah. So definitely this is a talk I'll be giving again here soon. But I think the point of it is like when you start creating an open source library, you really have to define some of the requirements. So like one of the important things you need to do. So at the beginning of the process, we needed to create what basically is an authenticator, and so we have a backend Cognito authentication authorization system. It does identity management, and we wanted to create a component that anybody could just drag and drop into their Vue app to add in this functionality to be able to log in or sign in, sign out, do federated login, to handle forgot your password, to handle multi-factor authentication. So we wanted a component kind of does all this together and with minimal amount of boilerplate to add to an application. So as I started this project, Vue 3 was coming into its own. Still definitely was early days in Vue 3. And so we had to make some decisions like, what kind of build system we use? So we had a lot of talk about using Vue CLI or Vite. And when I say we, it's mostly me, but the royal we. Then should we use JavaScript or TypeScript? And I think pretty obvious today that TypeScript's the way to go through most new projects. Not always, but most of the time, I believe. But back then, we had some questions because Vue 2 was famously known for not being very good at TypeScript back in the day. There was really good TypeScript libraries you can add, and Vue 3 was coming out, and Vue 3 had much better TypeScript support. And then the composition API or options API, this was first when everybody was really nervous about the composition API. Do you remember those days, Steve?
Well, what I remember is and I've talked about this before in here, is when the initial announcement came out about the whole restructure, the blowback was just like fierce. I think you got a lot of blowback from one of your videos, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. And I think the concern was backwards compatibility with Vue 2, if I remember correctly, and forcing everybody to completely redo all their code if they went to Vue 3. And they came back and said, okay, we're not going to destroy backwards compatibility with the options API. But that's my recollection of when Vue 3 first came out.
Yeah, exactly. And that we went through that. I mean, there was a whole lot of people were nervous about this. They were, and rightfully so. And so we had to make that decision too, as we were creating this new libraries. Like, what paradigm, what things do we do? This is an open source library. We want to make sure that as things continue on, developers are able to jump into the code base and use it in the proper ways. And then Pinya, we were thinking about state management systems. Like, Pinya is obviously pretty popular, but we're thinking about XState. And there's some things that I want to talk about that. And then we looked at Vuetify and Vuetify 3, and I know we've had John Leader on the show.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually used JSX for his open source library. So we considered that too. It's like, maybe we don't even use templates. Maybe we should just use JSX because JSX, we have a lot of React developers. So we kind of had to think of a lot of these decisions at the beginning and what was the best for us. And then we kind of thought of those decisions. That I'll tell you guys what we decided on. But we also had a set of requirements with our open source library, like accessibility. I think it's like table stakes for all. I think most libraries out there. Like, how accessible are you? Are you WCAG compliant? And that was something we strove for, being 2.1 AA WCAG compliant.
And
We had
WCAG is?
it's WCAG stands for it's the web accessibility. It's a
Okay.
test of web accessibility.
Okay.
I think it's web web content accessibility guidelines. So
Okay.
the w3.org lists out a set of guidelines for accessibility, and 2.1 is one of like those guidelines, and you can find it like at w3.org. And it's very dense document, but it gives you like a lot of information, and then there's tools that you can use to like test against that accessibility standard.
Mm-hmm.
I think we used one. Can't remember what we used. There's a handful of different tools, but anyways, then bundle size was like a really important consideration. So we looked at like, one thing I hate as a developer is when I bring in a package into my project and then all of a sudden it doubles the size of it when it builds. I'm like, what's the problem here? So we had to make sure the consideration of like, how do we keep that low? Then we think about like how you build packages in modern days. Like, back then, people were still using Node built-ins in their packages, and now it's pretty common that it's, everybody uses ESM. So make sure that we have, web components. We use Vite for our builder and bundler, and it uses rollup in the background to do it all. So we made sure we had that consideration. Plus, as we were creating this Vue 3 open source UI component, we were also simultaneously creating a Angular and a React version. And so we wanted to make sure we were using our best practices and we were using code between all three. So we decided to use a monorepo, was one way to handle that. And also we used XState.
Mm.
So this is kind of interesting. So XState's like a state management tools that use finite state machines. So you know exactly, like, it's if you ever use state machines like in your computer science programs, this might be familiar with you. Probably many people listening right now isn't, but it's a kind of a particular way of handling data where there's a one unique way that data flows through your application. And we really kind of latched on to that, especially since it had great package support, and we could create one state machine that we could share between our React, Vue, and Angular, and later our other implementations. So any of our JavaScript libraries, we can have this one state machine and then share it between all three. And that way we had kind of similar state and outcomes for all three, and it made it easier that we had basically every single between the different libraries were all very similar when we were done. Have you ever used XState?
We actually, I'm here looking real quick, but I talked to somebody about XState on either JavaScript, Java, or here. And I remember we had a really great, pretty in-depth talk about it. So my understanding from it,
Probably David K. Piano.
no, it was a gal. I don't know if it was Maya Shavin,
Okay.
or who was it we talked to. I'll have to find it and put it in the notes. But it was a good talk. And what I remember about state machines versus Vuex state management is that state machines had more to do strictly with, how do you say, the condition or the state of your app as compared to storing data in it, right? So for single page app, you would use Vuex or Pinia, whatever the case may be, to maybe grab data from your front end and put it in state so that it could be accessible by multiple components in a reactive way. Where state machine was more like, okay, I'm in this state, now I'm going to change and go to this state, whatever those things are in your app. So it's more narrowly focused and defined than a Vuex or a tool that's defined as state management.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to put it. So yeah, you're going from like one state to another state. So like if you log in, like if you're at the login page, that's one state. And then you click the login button, you're in another state. And then when you're authenticated, you're in another state. And then you can have data that's shared between those that you can share as well. But no, that's a perfect way to do it. And so we wanted to make sure our authenticator had each state, a certain state for each one of them, that we could share that between all different implementations. So it's definitely a different way to think about it. And then we looked at like VUE3 best practices, like composition API with script setup. We ended up using single file components with templates. We did not use the JSX, like I mentioned earlier.
Good for you.
We used TypeScript. I know, I'm on a VUE podcast and I'm talking about JSX.
Well, my experiences with it haven't always been positive. Maybe that's just because I'm not familiar with it, but it makes me nervous when I think about having to write in that.
The only time I ever did it was when I created a couple of videos on my YouTube channel, on Erik.video, which I was just playing around with JSX, and it's definitely different than it. There was some nuances and differences between it and using like a React app using JSX. So, and it takes time to get used to differences of doing things and instead of using your nice directives like VF and V4, and now you have to do maps and ternary operators. So we turned like, as we were going through this process, we decided like turn on TypeScript. We turned that on. We turned strict mode on. We had one point we had any, like you couldn't do any anywhere. For those of you know that any is a way to kind of opt out of TypeScript, but we ended up having it on. So there is definitely, even to this day, there's still some things that aren't typed. And then we used like some linting, ES3, VUE3 Essentials, use slots, things like that. So
I found my episode. It was Maya Shavin that we talked to, VUE 147 from, it's been almost exactly 2 years ago. Talked about XState.
So as we went through this process, it was pretty fun just jumping in and writing VUE code all day. We did a lot of testing. We set up Cypress end-to-end testing throughout the application, which we went back and forth. I think if we had to do it again, we would have focused more on VUE testing, unit testing with Jest, or using the vtest. But we decided because we found that one of the advantages of end-to-end testing is it's like you're basically as if you're the user and you're clicking around, and it's very like black box testing at that point, and it's very thorough, and it's one of the best ways you can test. But one of the disadvantages of it is it gets a little slow, and so it's a little bit slower overall. In our test suite, after adding in dozens and dozens of tests, it was taking quite a bit of time to run through all of them. And then I think the sweet spot is to have test coverage. I used to not be in favor of test coverage tools and having like an 80% unit test coverage, because you're in some organizations, people can manipulate that, or you're writing tests for the sake of tests just to pass some test coverage tool. But I found that having a great team of other front-end developers and just having a very high operational excellence bar, that you end up writing pretty good tests that get code reviewed by very smart people, and you can't get away with writing obviously bad tests. And so as we've seen with other different, with our React code base and everything, I think having like a combination of more unit tests and then have a separate amount of integration tests, I think would have been better. We've really over-focused, I think, on end-to-end tests. And that's changed a little bit recently, but at the beginning, it was definitely more end-to-end test focused.
Yeah, we do, in my day-to-day, we do a combination, since it's Laravel and Vue, we do a combination of PHP unit and then Dusk, which is end-to-end. It's basically like Cypress testing, and we tend to focus probably more on the end-to-end testing, just because we catch a lot of stuff with those tests for sure, and it takes a while. I think anytime we had to fix some things in our Circle CI configs, but we're looking about, I think it's around 15 minutes to run our test suite. I'm not sure where that compares to other people, but there's a ton of tests.
That's good.
But yeah, it takes a while to run those tests. So side note real quick, have you seen Playwright?
I have heard of it, yeah.
So I interviewed Debbie O'Brien about that here a couple months ago, 2-3 months ago. She's like the big DevRel for Playwright, and it looks really slick. I haven't had a chance to try it yet. It's basically a Cypress competitor, I think. And I know I've talked to the guy from Cypress probably 3-4 years ago on JavaScript Jabber about Cypress and how it works. They're both really pretty slick front-end testing libraries for sure. So there's multiple options out there for doing the front-end testing.
Yeah. I took last year at VueConf US, I took Jessica Sachs' Cypress course,
Uh-huh.
her workshop, and it
Mm-hmm.
was great. She deep dived into it. I think she's at Ionic now. She works in Stencil.js, speaking of Stencil.
That sounds familiar. What's her name again? I'm sorry.
Jessica Sachs,
Okay.
Sachs. But
Huh.
she ran a workshop last year at VueConf, and I think she's running another one this year too. So anybody's listening who's going to VueConf, you might want to check that out. Yeah, testing is very interesting. Yeah, we could do a whole podcast on testing. Yeah, I have some
Sure.
opinions. They've been changing recently based on
Mm.
it. We did one nice thing is I don't think many open source projects do this. We created a full canary suite. So we run through all our packages every 15 minutes. We test them out like in Vite, Vue CLI, even our React and Angular, same. We kind of build them with the latest version that we've published. And then we also run some end-to-end tests against them to make sure that nothing broke. And then we have like a canary that does that. And we're all using GitHub Actions to do it. We also use Cypress Cucumber, which is a way to kind of do behavior-driven development. It's almost like you write your tests in like human readable language, like scenario, sign in with unknown credentials. When I type this, do this. And I type this, then I see this. And this, you can translate it to like your Cypress definitions that you have. So yeah, we did a lot of work on testing on this library. I kind of fast forward a little bit to like what went well. I mean, kind of looking back on this, we the parity between like the Vue, React, and Angular versions of our authenticator was really well done. Like they were exactly the same. The testing, our end-to-end testing, ended up catching a lot of issues during our development lifecycle. So we are, even though we were mostly doing end-to-end tests and few unit tests, that still caught like majority of the issues. And we got a really lot of positive customer feedback with what we did. But some things I think, like looking back on creating an open source library, I would have done better for this project is we probably should have had higher ESLint levels just to catch more issues. I think as you go on with projects, just being very diligent to look at your ESLinting and can you kind of put it to the highest level. And Vue has like a Vue 3 recommended, but they have like higher levels, and you can add in your own ESLint rules. And I think we could have done a better job there. The library only supports Vue 3. This was really before there's Vudemy, and a few others that allow you to create open source Vue libraries that work with Vue 3 and Vue 2. But at the time, those didn't really exist, so we went all in on Vue 3. I think most of the community has transitioned to Vue 3 or at least Vue 2.7 at this point, which is fine. But you can still use our older library with Vue 2, but just with Vue 3, Vue 3 is, we created a new one just for Vue 3. And then there are lots of slots within slots. So we kind of took the approach of allowing you to override a lot of different places, and it kind of made the code complicated with these nested slots. And looking back, I think that could have been done better. And then it was harder to get like as a big company like AWS and even our team, it was still hard with an open source project to be able to get external contributors. Like, how do you kind of put out towards the world that, hey, this is an open source library? How do you get people coming in? How do they know that they can change things? How do they get the testing? Especially if you can't, it's really hard to do like end-to-end testing as a contributor. So like unit testing obviously would work much better. So there was some things like that we could have done better. But at the end of the day, we compared to our older library, this one was getting like double the amount of weekly downloads and NPM, and it's been continuing to grow. So that's a little bit about kind of the journey that I've been taking the last year and a half.
So, just for a little more detail, so this library is, I think we mentioned this, but I'll just clarify. It's designed for use with AWS, right? It's not something you can use to log into some external system. It's for use with basically Cognito, your authentication platform, and accessing AWS resources.
Yeah, so it's a component library, but to use it, it really geared towards Cognito, and you can use it with our other AWS tools. So there's a whole bunch of different AWS Amplify tools like the UI component library, but there's also a JavaScript library that works on any platform. And that one, and then there's a CLI, and there's a thing called Studio. So with Studio or CLI, you can provision your whole backend, including this Cognito authentication user pool, and then you can use the UI component library to easily log into those systems.
Yes, I know authentication is such a nightmare, I think, for anybody. That
Yeah.
having something like that that you can drop in and works for you is a very big time saver for sure.
Yeah, so that's one of the talks I'm working on. Hopefully it'll be out. Hopefully I'll get a couple talks that talk in. There's a bunch of VUE conferences coming up soon, so I'm looking forward to them. VUE Conf is coming up. VUE Live London is coming up. I think there's a couple more too.
And where's VueConf this year? I forgot.
It's in New Orleans.
That's right. I knew it was somewhere down south.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I've been to every. Not no, that's not true. I my first VUE Conf I've been to was 2020,
Mm-hmm.
right before the pandemic hit, which was weird because it was in March, right before the pandemic, and I noticed like a bunch of people were like leaving early from the conference. I think people were kind of getting nervous already at that point because that's when the lockdowns and shutdowns started
Oh,
happening. But they didn't cancel. To VUE's credit, they didn't cancel it, I guess, because it still
right,
wasn't at that level at that point.
right.
And then I did the online. I think it got canceled in 2020. Maybe it was virtual in 2021 and virtual in 2022, and now it's back to being in person this
Mm-hmm.
year, which is great. And if I remember correctly, someone tweet me at ErikCH if I'm wrong, but I think the first VueConf was also in New Orleans. So this is kind of like going back to the roots of the first VueConf. And that
Yeah, I
was
was
in
supposed to go
2017.
to 2019 in Orlando, Fort
Mm,
Lauderdale. It was in Florida, and I was all set to go, and I was signed up for one of Evan Yu's workshops on
wow.
like core Vue stuff, and my company was sending me. Well, I ended up leaving the company about a month or two before the conference, so I didn't get to go. It's like, dang, I should have waited a
Ah,
couple months and then left. But I
I want to
left.
go to the View. I want to go to the View Conf in Amsterdam. That's the one that I guess is even bigger than the one in the U.S. I've been told.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it already happened in February of this year, so I guess for next year.
Right.
But
Yes.
yeah, it's a big 3-day conference like the one in the U.S.
Is it always in Amsterdam? Is it always Vue.js as compared to like Vue Europe that rotates locations?
Um, I think it is. I'm not entirely sure actually.
Yeah, I'd love to get to it. There's so many people I know from the Vue community from doing the podcasts and other things that I've never met in person. So yeah, I definitely need to get out at some point and press the flesh, so to speak, and meet people in person.
Yeah.
I was all set to go this next year, I think, and then as with many places, budget cuts hit, and they're like, "Yeah, sorry, you're not going. At least we're not going to pay for you to go. Let's put it that way."
Yeah. That has been everywhere I've been. It's been the same thing. I was just while you were talking, I was just looking up the different Vue conferences all over the world. Um, but yeah, it's unfortunately I've seen the same thing. A lot of companies are cutting back on travel. So luckily, as a DA, I'm not as affected, but I
Mm-hmm.
am affected some.
That's part of your job, right?
Yeah, yeah. As long as I'm like participating, talking, being a part of it, that's fine. If I wasn't like being a part of it, then I wouldn't go.
Right. Cool. Alrighty. So let's move on to a couple of topics that Erik has covered in some of his videos and has to do with some items that are in the current 3.3 release that has yet to actually be released, still in beta 3 as of 2 days ago, as of this recording. Some changes to define model and define props.
Yeah, so I've been on a quest recently, especially with all the VUE 3.3 stuff dropping recently, to like figure out what's in it and try it out. And I was telling Steve before we started this podcast that probably should have someone in the Quorum team or Evan Yu himself to help explain some of these things, but I will try to do my best. But from what I've been playing around with it, I've been excited about these features. So one of them is view props. Well, let's start with, yeah, let's view props. And you can kind of play around with some of these things right now. Um, well, let me rephrase this. So if you go to like the GitHub and look at the Vue core, there's some betas out right now, and there was alphas before that that have some of these features in it. If you use the Vue playground, the Vue single file component playground, you can
That's
kind of
pretty
play
cool.
around with them today.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure if you're using Vue CLI, or excuse me, Vite, or create Vue tools out there, if you can kind of play around with these today. And also, since they're in beta and alpha, it's probably not production ready. Some things might change, but I think they're almost locked in. But what I've been doing to try to test it out in my channel is I've been using Vue macros. So some of these things are actually just macros changes. So if you Vue macros is a library that has a bunch of like official and experimental type macros that you can add into your Vue applications, and you can kind of macro is one of those ones. Like if you're in your script setup, you just add in. There's some built-in ones like uh, define emits, and define props, and a few others. Um, and you this Vue macros kind of adds these into your application today that might not be in the Vue core yet. So one of which is going to be in Vue 3.3, and this is define props, and it allows you to like destructure props, which is a really nice thing you can do. So if you've ever used props today, you have to be really careful about destructuring because you can lose reactivity. But with this new type of define props, you don't have to worry about that. There's also another change they added is allow you, when you're creating your application, you're adding types to your props, that now you can import them in from an external file. So before, if you try that, it gives you like an error, but now you can import in your type and then just directly inside your define props, inside your angle brackets, you can put them in, which is really cool. And then another thing I've been playing around with is define models. And it's hard to describe, but if you ever add like a V model to a component, you can pass in values from a parent component into a child component that you had the V model on, and it's two-way data bound. So if the child component changes it, it updates in the parent and vice versa. And typically when you pass values in as props into components in Vue, they're read-only. So if you try to change that prop value, it ends up giving you an error message that this prop is read-only, and this is not the proper way to do things. So today, even before, you can use vmodel, but you had to do this kind of weird syntax where you had to you had this update :model, and you had to emit the update back, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a little more complicated. So this vmodel, or this new define model, allows you, it's called define model, it's a macro, allows you to like just make the change in the child component, and as if it's just like a normal variable, and you can make the change without having to do this kind of emit dance. So it's a little bit less boilerplate, and it made a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, that's called component V model in the docs. I'll put a
Yeah,
link
V
to the show
model.
notes. And I'm actually using that in my app that I've been working on. It took me a little while to figure it out and get everything named properly, but once I got it working, it's great because, like in my particular use case with inertia, the way it works is in your controller, you say, okay, uh, render this page. Here's the page to render, and here's the props to pass to it. But if in your, and these are components that are in the pages directory, but if you have an included component within your main component that's being rendered, and you want to change data in there, you have to pass it back to the parent in order to communicate with the controller, if that makes sense. So in my particular case, I've got like a, it's a page component, and then I have an embedded table component with some sorting and filtering and searching capabilities in it. So I had to wire it using this in such a way that when you typed in the field in the child, it emitted to the parent and then communicated with the controller and did its thing. So it's a little confusing at first, the current method, where you have to name things just right and certain things have to be matched up. But once you figure it out, then it makes sense. So it sounds like with your description, then this will become a little cleaner and easier to use.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So, and you can use it multiple, you can use this define models and have it multiple different values you're passing in, and have it that kind of two-way data binded way. I think most people use V model just like on an input. It's kind of like the common use case is where,
Exactly.
yeah, where you're just trying to take a value from an input and have it available in your script. Uh, but this one is, it gets a little bit more complicated when you're passing values from like a parent to child component. And V model, I know somebody's listening right now and like, isn't that just syntactic sugar for
Yes, it
binding
is.
the value and then using a V on? Yes, you're right. So for those who don't know, yeah, you can do this without V model itself. You can bind values to inputs and then have look for input triggers and then set the value itself. And you can do the same thing with a component. But this makes it a lot easier. And then define models will make it even easier, so you don't have to handle um, the emits as the same way you had to before. And you can, it's almost like you're adding it like a ref, because you could do dot value in your child component. So these are all kind of neat new things that are coming out in Vue 3.3. One I didn't have time to play around with, which I really want to play around with, is generics. There is some limitations in TypeScript with props and if you're using generics, which I haven't like deep dived into, but Vue 3.3 is supposed to add that functionality too. And I think that's where a lot of people who are really TypeScript heavy, kind of more advanced applications are looking forward to, as TypeScript generics.
Right. Yeah, I like I was telling you beforehand, I'm going to have to dip my toes in the TypeScript pool here soon. I know it. I'm getting sucked into the vortex. I know it. Although, side note, and this is interesting, and I can't remember if you and I talked about this or if I did this in JavaScript Jabber. Have you seen that Svelte? Rich Harris talked about this, is getting rid of TypeScript.
No.
So yeah, it was. I can find the link somewhere. I saw it on Hacker News, and I was talking with somebody in a Discord channel about this, and the proper context isn't that you can't use TypeScript in Svelte. It's just that they're not going to use it in the core, but it will still support it if when you're writing your Svelte components, you still want to use TypeScript. So it's perfectly fine. But he talks a little bit about it and why they did it, and existing tools are enough without the overhead of TypeScript.
Nice.
So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I wonder what the rationale is not using it in core. I think it really helps with just like catching bugs. I mean, now you have types, so now it's like you have a typed language and you can catch things easier. I remember back in the day, I don't know, years ago, I was working on an app and we used TypeScript on it, and TypeScript wasn't as popular as it was today, but someone was like, we could just use TypeScript and we don't have to do testing at all, because this is like basic, like a very, very thin layer of protection in our app, but maybe this is all we need to do. So I think in this app we created, we didn't have any tests, but we did have TypeScript. So we had something to catch obvious
Oh,
issues
I
as long as
see.
we typed everything.
Uh-huh. Wait, where was it? Oh, here it is. Okay. Yeah, I found the article. So, all right. Last topic. Oh, before I forget, I'm jumping all over
Yeah.
the place here. We were talking about macros. What is a macro? To me, when I think of macros, this goes way back to days gone by when I was working in something like Excel, a spreadsheet. And so a macro was a way to automate running a multi-step process. So you could, I'm going to open this tab and click here in this cell and type this in and run these calculations, whatever it was, and it would record it, and then you could assign it to a button in your bar and say, run this macro, and it would do all that for you. So is that similar to what macros are here that you're talking about in Vue, or is they completely different?
Yeah. So I'm looking up the definition as you're talking, but they in the Vue guide it talks about macros are globally available and you don't need to import them. So that's one of the ideas is that you don't have to import macros into your component, and then they have like bits of kind of maybe similar to what you're talking about, like some functionality inside them. So the macros that are already built into Vue, I believe there's 3 of them. I have to look them up. I think define props, define emits are 2 of them. Define expose.
Hmm.
So those are 3 macros that
Mm-hmm.
are built into Vue.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're using a composition API using script setup, then you would do like const prop equals define props,
Right.
and then you can put in like an array of or an object with key values of every single prop, but
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to go import and define props.
Right. As compared to a composable, which is something that you would write, but you would have to import it in the places where you specifically want to use it.
Yes, yeah. So if you had some functionality and you wanted to kind of reuse it in multiple places, then you can put it in its own file, usually with the use at the beginning of it, like
Right.
use handler or use mouse, and then you would import that into your app, and then you would have that functionality. So some people don't like these because like it kind of looks like magic. Um, th-
Voodoo.
yeah, and they're called compiler macros.
Right.
Um, and then they do not need to be imported, and they're compiled away when script setup is processed too.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Because anytime you have something that's globally available, the concern obviously is, are you importing it and having it in there in places where it's not being used? And is it causing, overhead problems because it's everywhere?
That's
But
true. Yeah, I think since it's compiled away, like it's not going to have those issues. It's part of the compiler, like looks for that name. I have noticed like in VS Code, you definitely need to make sure you have Volar installed, and you have to make sure at least Volar. Otherwise, you'll get a bunch of, if you open a .vue file, it won't recognize it. It'll think that these macros need to be imported in. Like I have had issues in the past where VS Code has something wrong with it, and all of a sudden it keeps telling me like doesn't recognize define props, doesn't recognize this. So you have to be careful with that. But as long as you have like the right extensions installed in the latest version of VS Code or whatever WebStorm or whatever IDE you use, then it should be fine. I like them. There was a whole talk about reactivity transform was going to add even more define these compiler macros, and there was a lot of talk out there about like people really did not like them. It was adding like way too much magic. It was allow you to like unwrap refs using dollar signs, and it wasn't really obvious of what the dollar sign meant, and people dislike that. And that's actually not going to be in Vue 3.3. Evan Yu's already talked about how he does not want it on there.
mm-hmm.
I know I should say if keep me honest, Steve, if I'm going into like an advanced topic or a topic that needs to be explained more, we can break that down further.
Oh yeah, I'm all about the definitions for sure. I remember one time always brings me back. I listened to a podcast, and they were talking about oh gosh, what was it? Reactivity. the observables type of thing,
Mm,
and there was a
yeah.
particular observable library, and for the life of me, I can't remember what it was.
RxJS?
Yeah, I think yes, it was RxJS, and it
Mm.
was John Papa on his episode, and so they dived in and started talking about RxJS and all this stuff, and I got to the end, I said, "What's observables and what is Rx supposed to do?" and all this. I didn't get it. I tweeted him and said, "Hey, John, next time you got to describe this." Oh yeah, okay, good point. So yeah, I always like to make sure that we define the things that we're talking about so people don't confuse.
Yeah, there is some viewisms out there that, like, I think even when I'm working out my work and I talk to React developers or Angular developers, they're like, what? You're emitting data? Like, don't you just pass everything down as functions? Or like, well, no, we have this paradigm that we use and we have these refs. What? You don't have like a use state? Yeah, it's definitely worth explaining some of these topics, especially for people who may not be knowledgeable at them.
Yeah, so you got to be aware of the geek speak and the acronym speak. So speaking of geek speak and acronym speak, let's talk ref versus reactive. Um, these are, for those who may not be familiar with them, they are ways to define what is it, reactive data. In Vue 3 with the composition API, where before, in Vue 2, you would define in your script, you would define your data function. It's actually a function, not an object, and that would return whatever pieces of data you wanted to define in component that you wanted to be reactive, whether it was a string, an object, an array, a number, whatever. And so now we wrap them with ref and reactive to use JS proxies. And that's about all I know from them, except how to use them. So let's talk ref versus reactive. There are differences between the two, and I know I've seen numerous blog posts written about them just to explain them. So with that, we'll let Erik explain them all.
I don't have
No
so
pressure.
I've been researching ref versus reactive. I've been using them, but it's kind of arbitrary. Like when I use one versus the other. I used to always use refs, and then I started been getting more reactives, and I've been thinking about like when should I use when, and I'm working on a conference like talk on this or a blog post or maybe in a video at some point. And I've been researching, and there's definitely a lot of different opinions on it. But I guess to define some terms, like anytime you do add in like reactive data, so like let's say something that needs to change in the template and it needs to be kind of updated. As you're updating the script, it needs to be updated in the template, then you'd make something reactive. And ref usually it takes in as like a primitive or an object. So you can have like a string or boolean in there. While reactive reactive is the keyword, and then that would be more for just objects. So and ref has a couple different differences too. With refs, you use .value everywhere. So if you define something, you can do something .value, and you can get to it. While reactive, you don't need to. You can just reference it directly. Ref, you can also kind of do a complete reassignment with .value. You can equal something. Well, reactive is not quite the same, or you don't have a kind of that type of reassignment there. As for using one versus the other, I've gone in this habit of using refs quite more often than reactive because since it can support objects, it seems to be a little bit easier for me. One pattern that I've been using is I'll put in a lot of my logic into a composable, and I kind of stole this from VUEs and other popular composable libraries. Is I'll put all my reactive variables in there, and then I'll export them out as an object with each ref as a different value inside there. So then you can destructure the values out as I import it in, because I'll import them in and then destructure the object with each ref, and it'll keep its reactivity. So that's one technique. Also, if you use reactive by itself and then you try to destructure, you lose reactivity. So that's like a reason that you got to be kind of careful with that too. So that's my opinion. I'm still kind of doing some more research and seeing what other people think. There was something called, we kind of touched on it before, with reactivity transform, where it was like a compiler macro that allowed you to like not be, you could basically use a dollar sign and not have to use dot value everywhere when you're using refs. But I think that's kind of gone out of favor, and they're not going to. You could still use it if you use like a third-party library, like that VUE macros library. But otherwise, I think we're not going to see that. And then if you look at if you even look at the implementation of some of these things, like for ref, let me see here. Yeah, if you look at the implementation for ref in the Vue 3, it actually uses reactive to
Right.
reactive,
That's right. I remember that.
which is
Looked at that.
kind of interesting. So it feels like ref, I think, would be depending on your situation. I've been using just ref more often. Do you have an opinion on this?
I have to go back and look at my code. I know I've wrestled with this a few times, and looking at the Vue docs on reactivity basic or fundamentals, excuse me. The one difference is that reactive can only work for object type, right? Objects, arrays,
Right.
collections, whereas ref can handle scalar types. So, a string, some sort of non-object value, single value. So I remember somewhere, and I think we were talking about this, Eric, there was one can handle mutating deeper object items, and one doesn't. And I don't remember which is which. Don't shoot me if I'm wrong. Somebody can fact check me on this if they want. But I remember that's one thing I read about. And I think my tendency is to use ref. Like you said, just because it handles more use cases in terms of the data types, and I haven't really seen any issues where you'd want to use ref versus reactive versus ref, shall we say. The one thing that is trickier in accessing the data, depending on whether you're doing it within your template versus another function or something else in your script, is how to access the actual values. Sometimes you have to use values, sometimes you don't. And then I like to look at things in the debugger, in the dev tools, in the browser. And now when you spit out something, it's wrapped in a proxy, and so you got to drill down to figure what your data is, and haven't quite gotten down how to spit that out to the console in a little cleaner way. But I think you have to stringify it or do something. But yeah, that's the only downsides I've seen to that. It's definitely a different paradigm from Vue 2. Vue 2 was a lot simpler in how it handled that, making reactive data. So and I'm just from a coding standpoint, it seems that the benefits are more behind the scenes than they are in how you're actually writing your components. If anything, it's made it harder.
Well, I'm glad it just works. Like I've been doing a lot of React lately and having to worry about use effects and using use state and making sure that I'm not re-rendering too many times and making sure I have my dependency array correct. And I'm just glad I'm like using Vue and I'm like, I just put this ref here, it works, and I'm happy with it. I did ran into one scenario where I was using a pretty complicated nested object and I was using ref and I just didn't love the way I was like reassigning the values.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, I've had very little issues at all just using ref everywhere in my code base. But yeah, it's great. And I think there's a whole discussion about like ref. I think Evan, you even had a Twitter post about this, how signals has become like this word signals and has become this real popular idea maybe a couple months ago. I haven't heard too much about people talking about it, but where like React is getting signals and the signals is kind of native to, this other platform, and it's a better way of handling like reactive state, and it has this kind of almost observability pattern to it. It's almost like an observable, and it's kind of been around for a long time in other languages or frameworks and libraries. But Evan, you was like, well, this basically ref is essentially the same thing as a signal. Like we already have this built into Vue, so it's not, and you can even recreate exactly how it's used in this other framework by doing it this way. So it's really nice that we already have this built in, and we don't have to worry about state, like the way like React does.
Yeah, you actually have a video up here with Evan. I'm looking at. I try to create signals in Vue with Evan Yu's help.
Yes, yes, yeah. I did kind of deep dive into signals and took some inspiration from what he posted online, and I created something called create signal. Uses shallow ref to do it, which is then analogous to what signals are in these other languages. And then I did it again using solid. So I showed like how solid uses create signal and how it's really similar to Vue's ref. So yeah, if anybody's interested in that, yeah, check out my channel, Program with Erik, or Erik.video.
All right, so we're getting low on time. So first, we'll thank Erik for sharing his wisdom with us yet again, and experience, and his videos. Like he said, Program with Erik, E-R-I-K, by the way, on YouTube or Erik.video, where you can find all of his goods. And I'll drop some links to those videos in the show notes for this particular episode.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's move on to picks. Picks are part of the show where we got to talk about whatever we want, within reason, of course. Not violating any FCC rules or anything. But I got a couple picks today before I get to what is widely considered the high point of any episode of mine, which is the dad jokes of the week. Mm-hmm. First of all, did some flying this last week and went to Chicago. And on the way, I watched a video and, a movie. And for the movies, the one I watched was 1917, which is really a cool movie. It takes place during World War I, and the premise is that it talks about the communications where one unit had to be, it's the British Army, I believe, had to let it know that they shouldn't do an attack because it was a trap by the Germans and they didn't want everybody to get slaughtered. And so they sent two guys. I think it's about a day's journey to get to this unit. But what was cool about the movie is that the way they filmed it, and that instead of, it's a typical movie where you jump around in different camera angles and you're changing who's being viewed, the camera follows these two guys, or at least two for as long as both are in the movie, spoiler alert, it just follows them all the time. It never takes your eyes off both the characters, the main character. It was really unique at the time. And if I remember right, it won a number of awards.
Wait, what happens if they left? Did they ever leave each other?
Well, it's been a few years, so I guess I can.
No, don't spoil it. But
I'll say both of them didn't make it to the end. Let's put it that way.
I know, but if the camera's on both of them at the same time, don't they ever one has to go to the bathroom and the other one's sitting on the?
Oh, come on! This is the movies. They don't talk about that kind of stuff. You got to remember, in the movies, people don't get cold or hot. They don't, they don't go to the bathroom. Anyway, so
I'll have to check it out. I've heard good things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good movie. But the problem is, like most movies that I watch on the plane, a lot of times I'll start too late, and so the plane will land before I'm done. And so then when I go to find it, I got to pay for it and rent for it, and I'm too cheap. I've never seen the end of The Lincoln Lawyer, with Matthew McConaughey, because I saw it on a plane and I can't find it anywhere, like Netflix or Amazon or anything. So I might have to just quit being cheap and spring to pay for this one just so I can watch it. And then on a geekier note, saw an interesting article on Hacker News today about, oh my gosh, I just didn't lose it. I think I killed it. It was about import maps being available in all browsers now, which is more of a, when you're importing modules like ES6 type of functionality in Vite versus, your front end code. But it was, seemed to be sort of a big deal, and the guy did a pretty good description of what they are and how you'd use them. Here we go. JavaScript import maps are now supported cross-browser on web.dev by Thomas Steiner. So I'll drop a link to that in the show notes. And then for the dad jokes of the week, I got to get my sound effects here.
Do I get to go with my own pick? Or?
Oh, yeah. Oh, we wouldn't dream of leaving you out, but we saved the best for last. So that's why.
No, please. I like to hear the dad joke then.
So, for sure. We wouldn't dream of not letting the guest have their jokes. So, I was in the library not too long ago, and I asked the librarian if they had any books on different noise levels, and she said, "Sure. What volume would you like?" Right. Simple question: what is a pirate's? There's pirate jokes are everywhere, but what's a pirate's least favorite letter? And not letter
R?
in the alphabet, a letter that they get in the mail. The letter is, "Dear sir, we hereby summon you to court for a hearing related to the illegal downloading and proliferation of the following copyrighted media."
Ah.
That kind of pirate, right? And then I was working on a crossword puzzle the other day, and I was having trouble in one. So I asked my wife, I said, "Hey, can you help me? The clue for this one item is overworked postman." And she said, "Sure. How many letters?" I said, "I'm guessing too many." Right?
It's pretty good.
Yes. So those are the dad jokes of the week. All right, Eric, your turn. Picks. What do you got for us?
Yes, I have one. Have you seen, I think I'll ask you, Steve, have you seen Blue Sky?
Let me look at my window. No, it's cloudy right now.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Blue. Now that I think, I have been seeing that, all the rage about that. I think I saw you had to have an invite or something like that, sort of Google style ways of doing it. And I've applied for one, but I haven't been given one. And it sounds like it's a social media, some sort of thing. Yeah. What is it?
Yeah. So they're Twitter, love it or hate it. It's pretty much the de facto community. Probably one of the biggest social media communities for developers out there, and definitely not perfect. Has its pros and cons, but recently, Mastodon was another kind of Twitter kind of clone that came out, open source, that came out a few months ago, especially when Elon took over Twitter. A lot of people decided to check that out. But Jack Dorsey, the creator, one of the co-founders of Twitter, actually was not the first, actually did not create Twitter. He was a co-founder of it. He actually came on later, but everybody basically has co-founder status. Created Blue Sky Social, which is like they call it a decentralized social network protocol. And it's spun out by Twitter Inc. in 2019. It's hired its first employees in 2021. And it's essentially a very, very much clone almost of Twitter. It's in private beta now, so everybody who wants to get into it, everybody's getting FOMO. Everybody's getting the fear of missing out on it because they're only handing out a certain amount of invites a week, and only power users who are using using Blue Sky a lot, and I guess they're not called tweets. I forgot to call it skeets or something. I think they have a different name. And it's all private. Are getting invites, and they're sending those out. So everybody on Twitter, especially with all the drama that's happened on there in the last 6 months, have wanted to get into Blue Sky, and I've luckily I have gotten one, and I've been trying out for the last week, and it's pretty neat. I haven't seen too many differences between Twitter and Blue Sky so far. One kind of, I guess, unique thing is your Twitter profile. Mine's ERIKCH, Eric CH, but you can have it be your domain name. So if your domain is like, I don't know, Eric programwitheric.com, I can have my name on Blue Sky be programwitheric.com. So some people have started doing that. A lot of big tech people in our industry have already on there. I've seen a lot of really amazing developers on there. So it has a very techie feel to it, techie vibe right now. And that's pretty interesting too. So I'm a kind of a wait and see attitude. I'm going to use it at the same time, but I'm not giving up on Twitter. I'm not sure if what'll happen. I think they're going to continue like sending out invites, and hopefully eventually it'll be like public. But right now it's that, and right now it's only on your phone. I think you can get the desktop app. I think there's a link to it, but it's not quite ready yet.
So it's not like a web app, like you can go to twitter.com.
No, I think everybody is using it on their mobile phones right now.
Okay.
At
So
least as of
speaking
this
of invites, do you have one you can pass my way?
I have not been granted any. So
Oh, okay.
when you log into Blue Sky and you create your account for the first time, on your profile page, it'll tell you how many invites you have,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody starts with 0. And
Mm.
then I think this is the way it works. I think the more you use the service, they'll give you more invites. I've only put out a few, I don't know, tweets on Blue Sky. I'm just gonna call them tweets.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't gone that far. One thing I don't love about jumping into social media or these services is now I have to like start over again. So
Yes.
now I have to I'm back to 0 followers and I have to kind of work on it, which is kind of bad. But I do like how geeky the community is. It's very developer friendly, developer focused right now. It's starting to branch out. They're starting to get some celebrities, and AOC joined last week, and so it'll be interesting. We'll see how it goes, if people will start using it or if it'll catch on some momentum.
Yeah, we'll see. Is it centralized but decentralized? Like the whole thing with Mastodon, right? Is you could start your own servers, and it's sort of different groups as compared to one big giant central network, sort of like Twitter is. I think you mentioned it was decentralized. How does that work with Blue Sky, or what makes it unique other than just being a different app?
I don't know how the decentralization works. I know it has an API and has this social protocol. I wonder if the architecture is decentralized somehow. I don't think it's to the point I don't like Mastodon. You can literally create your own Mastodon server,
Mm-hmm.
and then it would connect to other Mastodon servers. I think this is it's private to Blue Sky, but maybe their architecture is decentralized.
Hmm.
Maybe it's cheaper to run. I don't know.
Interesting. Yeah, I've been curious to check it out. I applied for an invite, so who knows if I'll ever get one. If anybody out there listening and wants to send one my way, Wonder95 at Twitter, I'm uh, happy to take one just to check it out for sure. Alrighty, so with that, we will wrap it up. We've been talking for a while, as always happens. It's pretty rare that I start talking and run too short. That's for sure.
Yep.
So with that, we will say goodbye. Thank you to Erik for coming on and enlightening us, and good times. So
Yep.
we will talk to you all next time on Views on VUE.